On a cold Christmas Eve in 1895, snow drifted quietly across the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Beyond towering iron gates, something extraordinary had just been finished. It was called a house, but that word hardly applies. Biltmore was not simply large, it was unprecedented. With 250 rooms, it dwarfed even the White House, which had little more than half that number. The estate contained nearly 179,000 square feet of interior space, over 4 acres under a single roof. A person could sleep in a different bedroom every night for more than a month without repetition. At a time when indoor plumbing was still a luxury, Biltmore offered 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and comforts few Americans could imagine. The excess was staggering. 65 fireplaces warmed the house. 3 separate kitchens supported daily operations. An indoor swimming pool held 70,000 gallons of heated water, while most families still bathed in tin tubs. There was a bowling alley, a gymnasium, and a library capable of holding 10,000 books. Yet what made Biltmore truly astonishing was its location. This palace did not rise in Manhattan among other Gilded Age monuments, nor in Newport where the wealthy competed through summer mansions. It stood deep in the mountains of North Carolina, surrounded by what was then considered wilderness, far from any major city. Building it was an undertaking unlike anything America had seen. Construction lasted 6 years and required more than 1,000 workers. Skilled craftsmen were brought from across Europe because the work demanded expertise unavailable locally. Entire rail lines were constructed just to deliver materials. Indiana limestone was shipped by the ton. Marble arrived from Italy, oak from England, and tiles from Spain. The cost reached $6 million, an amount that today would exceed $200 million. That sum could have funded colleges or built entire towns. Instead, it created one home. When completed, Biltmore became and remains the largest privately owned residence ever built in the United States. The question lingers, why would anyone build something so vast, so remote, so seemingly impractical? The answer lies with George Vanderbilt, a man unlike the rest of his powerful family. Born into one of the wealthiest dynasties in American history, George was surrounded by ambition and competition. His brothers dominated railroads and finance, while society followed their every move. George, by contrast, avoided attention. He preferred books to boardrooms, learning to social maneuvering. Shy, deeply private, and intensely curious, he stood apart even within his own family. George inherited staggering wealth from his grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose ruthless business tactics had created the largest private fortune in the nation. But George lacked the Commodore's hunger for conquest. Instead of expanding industries, he expanded his mind. He became fluent in 8 languages, studied history, art, architecture, agriculture, and forestry, and assembled a personal library of more than 23,000 volumes. These were not decorative collections. They read them, marked them, and lived among them. Throughout his 20s, George traveled Europe not as a tourist, but as a student. He walked through French chateaux, English country estates, Italian palazzos, and German castles. He studied how buildings related to land, how estates sustained themselves, how beauty and function coexisted. Gradually, a vision formed to create an American estate that matched Europe's great houses, not as imitation, but as evolution. That vision found its home in Asheville, North Carolina. Visiting for his mother's health, George fell in love with the ancient mountains, the mist-filled valleys, and the sense of space unknown in New York. Where others saw abandoned farmland and depleted forests, George saw opportunity. Quietly and fairly, he began buying land. Over time, he assembled 125,000 acres, nearly 200 square miles. While his family questioned his sanity, George planned restoration. He hired a young forester named Gifford Pinchot to heal the land, replant forests, restore streams, and demonstrate scientific forestry for the first time in America. At the center of this vast estate, George would build his home. Not a summer retreat, not a city mansion, a permanent residence devoted to beauty, knowledge, and sustainability. For the design, he turned to Richard Morris Hunt, America's most prestigious architect. George was clear. He wanted a French Renaissance chateau inspired by the great estates of the Loire Valley. The scale was enormous, the location remote, the ambition overwhelming. But George had patience, vision, and unlimited resolve. Construction began in 1889. European stonemasons carved limestone by hand. Artisans shaped plaster ceilings, oak paneling, stained glass, and tile floors. Every detail passed through George's approval.
While the exterior echoed medieval France, the interior embraced modern innovation: electricity, central heating, elevators, refrigeration, intercoms, fire alarms, technology decades ahead of most American homes. Beauty and comfort were never separate in George's mind. The landscape mattered just as much as the house. Frederick Law Olmsted, designer of Central Park, shaped the grounds. He designed winding approach roads, formal gardens near the house, and productive farmland beyond. The estate became self-sustaining, producing food, managing forests, and supporting hundreds of workers. Biltmore was not just a mansion, it was a living system. When the doors opened on Christmas Eve in 1895, guests arrived to something unimaginable: a French chateau rising from the Appalachian Mountains. Inside, they stepped first into an indoor winter garden filled with light, plants, and flowing water. Beyond it stood a banquet hall with a ceiling 7 stories high, hung with centuries-old tapestries and illuminated by electric chandeliers disguised as medieval ironwork. A massive dining table seated 64 guests beneath steel trusses hidden as carved wood. Room after room revealed artistry and intention: a library built for reading, not display, music rooms designed for intimate performances, bedrooms filled with warmth and comfort, bathrooms with hot and cold running water at a time when most Americans still used outhouses, a Roman-style swimming pool, a gymnasium, a bowling alley, wine cellars, and workshops, all hidden beneath elegance. Yet none of this functioned on its own. Behind the scenes worked an invisible workforce of nearly 80 servants. They cooked, cleaned, repaired, managed, and maintained every aspect of the house. Many lived on site, their days structured around keeping the estate running flawlessly. Their presence was felt everywhere, even when unseen. Biltmore was not built to intimidate, it was built to endure. While other Gilded Age palaces were sold, demolished, or forgotten, George Vanderbilt's vision survived, still owned by his descendants, still alive with visitors, still standing strong more than a century later. What began as one man's quiet dream became a legacy of beauty, knowledge, and permanence carved into stone in the mountains of North Carolina. Life inside Biltmore House functioned according to a strict and carefully organized hierarchy. At the top stood the house steward, effectively the chief executive of the entire domestic operation. Beneath him was a complex structure of authority and specialization that allowed the enormous household to function smoothly every day. 2 positions held exceptional power: the butler and the housekeeper. The butler oversaw all male servants and managed dining room operations, while the housekeeper commanded the female staff and ensured every room in the house met exacting standards of cleanliness and order. Together, they hired and dismissed staff, set schedules, enforced discipline, and ran Biltmore's daily life with near military precision.
Below them worked an army of specialists. Ladies' maids attended to female guests, caring for elaborate wardrobes, styling hair, and anticipating every personal need. Valets served the men, laying out clothing, drawing baths, and keeping shoes polished to perfection. In the kitchens, a head chef supervised multiple sous chefs, producing meals that stretched across a dozen courses. Kitchen maids handled the exhausting physical labor, washing dishes, cleaning surfaces, and preparing endless quantities of vegetables. Footmen served meals, maintained public rooms, answered doors, and carried messages throughout the house using Biltmore's advanced intercom system. Housemaids were responsible for the bedrooms, making beds, dusting furniture, sweeping floors, tending fireplaces, and, before modern plumbing was fully operational, emptying chamber pots. Laundry maids worked deep in the basement, washing linens by hand in staggering quantities as guests constantly arrived and departed. Outside the house, dozens of gardeners maintained the elaborate landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. Grooms cared for horses and carriages. Farm workers managed dairies, orchards, and vegetable fields. Foresters worked across the estate's vast acreage, implementing the revolutionary forestry methods introduced by Gifford Pinchot.
The servants' days began long before sunrise. Housemaids rose before dawn to light fires in bedrooms so the family would wake to warm rooms. Kitchen staff started even earlier, preparing breakfast hours before George Vanderbilt appeared downstairs. By the time the household seemed calm and effortless, it had already been alive with activity for hours. That invisibility was intentional. The ideal servant was one who moved unseen. Servants lived in a separate world within Biltmore. Hidden staircases allowed them to move throughout the house without crossing paths with guests. They ate in their own dining rooms below stairs, spaces still more comfortable than those available to servants in many other households. George Vanderbilt treated his staff well by the standards of the time. Wages were fair, housing was comfortable, and food was plentiful. But the work was relentless. Housemaids walked miles each day through corridors and staircases. Kitchens were brutally hot. Laundry work was physically exhausting. Most staff worked 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons free if circumstances allowed. Every aspect of life revolved around the needs of the family and their guests. Strict rules governed behavior. Rank determined social interaction. Higher-ranking servants did not associate with lower-ranking ones. Men and women were largely kept separate. When the family was present, servants spoke only when spoken to, avoided eye contact, and never shared opinions or personal troubles. Their success was measured by how little attention they attracted. Yet despite the hardship, there was prestige in serving at Biltmore. Training was rigorous and invaluable. Staff learned how to serve elaborate meals, care for priceless antiques, and operate cutting-edge technologies like electric lighting and elevators. A recommendation from Biltmore's butler or housekeeper could secure employment at any major estate in America. Many servants spent decades at Biltmore. They witnessed George Vanderbilt's marriage, the birth of his child, and mourned his death. Their names rarely appeared in history books, but they became part of the estate's living memory. Maintaining such a workforce was enormously expensive, and servant costs alone doomed many Gilded Age estates. While George Vanderbilt could afford it, even his fortune felt the strain, especially as he invested heavily in forestry, farming, art, books, and lavish entertaining. Despite its agricultural ambitions, Biltmore consumed far more than it produced. In its early years, however, wealth seemed endless. George hosted grand house parties that lasted weeks. His guest lists included the most prominent figures of the Gilded Age: writers, artists, scientists, politicians, and social elites. He was a gracious host who wanted Biltmore to serve as a center of culture and learning, not merely a display of wealth. Edith Wharton visited multiple times, sharing George's love of literature and European culture.
Henry James also came, recognizing the irony of a French chateau rising from the American wilderness, yet appreciating the sincerity of George's vision. Other guests brought livelier energy. Alice Roosevelt, the famously rebellious daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, adored Biltmore. She later recalled swimming in the indoor pool, attending extravagant dinners, and marveling at the audacity of building such a palace in the mountains. Portrait painter John Sargent visited and worked there, lending artistic validation to George's creation. Hunting parties were also common, with guests spending weeks on the estate tracking deer, bear, and wild turkey before returning each evening to fine wine, billiards, and cigars. Christmas became one of Biltmore's most cherished traditions. Each year the banquet hall filled with greenery and towering trees, sometimes over 20 feet tall. Guests arrived from across the country to celebrate with elaborate meals, music, and caroling beneath the glass ceiling of the winter garden. Servants worked long hours but shared in the spirit through bonuses and their own celebrations. George understood that loyalty and morale were essential to running such an estate. Despite the grandeur, something was missing. George approached 40 still unmarried, living alone in a house built for family life. Society speculated, and his relatives worried. Then everything changed. In 1998, George met Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in Paris. She was outgoing where he was reserved, socially confident where he was shy. A well-connected widow with extensive European experience understood society and estate management in ways George never had. Their marriage was of genuine affection, not convenience. They wed quietly in Paris and returned to Biltmore together. Edith transformed the estate. She brought order, efficiency, and warmth. Where George had built with artistic passion, Edith managed with practical intelligence. She renegotiated contracts, streamlined staff, improved farm efficiency, and addressed the estate's financial bleed without diminishing its grandeur. Within a year, she gave birth to their daughter, Cornelia, finally filling Biltmore's nurseries with life. These years were likely the happiest of George's life. That happiness was short-lived. In 1914, George died unexpectedly during surgery, just 51 years old. Edith was left a widow for the second time, with a teenage daughter and the largest private house in America, still operating at a loss. As World War I began and the Gilded Age faded, maintaining such an estate became increasingly difficult. Edith took full control, reducing staff, closing unused rooms, scaling back entertaining, and pushing the estate towards financial sustainability. The Great Depression forced her boldest decision. In 1930, Edith opened Biltmore House to paying visitors. Society was scandalized, but the move saved the estate. Later, she sold most of the original land to the federal government, creating Pisgah National Forest and preserving George's forestry legacy. During World War II, Biltmore sheltered priceless artwork from Washington, D.C., temporarily housing one of the most valuable art collections in the world. Edith died in 1958 at 92, having preserved Biltmore against overwhelming odds. Later generations continued adapting. Under George's grandson, William Cecil, the estate expanded into wine production, hospitality, and events. Tourism, wineries, hotels, and diverse revenue streams transformed Biltmore into a sustainable family enterprise. Today, Biltmore stands as a rare survivor of the Gilded Age, still owned by the family that built it, still alive with purpose. It endures not because it resisted change, but because each generation embraced it. What George created as a private dream has become a public legacy, proof that vision, determination, and adaptation can preserve even the most improbable ambition.